Today we're going to stick with our theme of kind of modern mythology. We're going to take a look at a wonderful story. Actually, it's part of a series of stories by C.S. Lewis. It's called The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is part of the Chronicles of Narnia series. And these were a series of children's books. I'll do a little bit of introduction to Lewis and the series as we get into the lecture, but this is going to be really in line with everything that we've been covering over the course of all of these lectures, the whole idea of the heroic transformation, the hero's journey. This story, I think, out of the entire Narnia series is probably the best as capturing the heroic transformation and the hero's journey. And it's going to hopefully remind you of a lot of the stories that we've already addressed in the past. As a matter of fact, I'm going to call your attention to some of those stories as we get into the lecture. But for now, let's start by talking about Voyage of the Dawn Treader as a Narnian odyssey, right? It's a sea voyage story. So we've already talked about other sea voyages, everything from Jason and the Golden Fleece to, briefly Odysseus himself. This story is also a quest story. Specifically, it's a quest for the holy, right? Another thing that we've covered in the past when we talked about the Holy Grail quest. Okay, so again, you're going to see lots and lots of parallels. And what you need to know, of course, is Lewis was very, very familiar with ancient mythology, medieval romances, and things like that. So in a way, this story of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is even a flashback to the first story that we covered this semester as far as hero stories go, the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Our very first hero story was a journey in quest of immortality. It was a journey across the waters of death, the sea, to the end, to the limits of existence. And that's exactly what Lewis is presenting to us in this book. Now, let's do a little bit of a background on Lewis himself. Clive Staples Lewis, very famous writer, mostly for the Narnia series. I mean, that's probably his most famous work, but he wrote tons of other stuff. He was a scholar of medieval literature. He was a literary critic, a novelist, and he was also a lay theologian. He was very interested in theology and is considered a Christian apologist of sorts. Okay, so I'm going to talk again about his whole Christian perspective and what he's attempting to do in the Narnia series in a little bit. But his background was actually in Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, ancient history, as well as English literature, where he studied at Oxford, ended up becoming a fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, and later the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. So this guy's a scholar, like I was saying. In 1929, he became a Christian. Oh, sorry, not a Christian. He became a theist. He was originally an atheist, converted to theism, which is just the idea that he now believes that there is some higher being, a god of sorts, and then within a few years he becomes a Christian. And one of the big influences on his life happened to be a very close friend of his, another Oxford scholar and somebody that I know we've mentioned a number of times this semester, which is J.R.R. Tolkien. Okay, the two are close companions, friends, even part of a kind of a literary discussion group by the name of the Inklings. They used to gather together, and they definitely influenced each other in what they wrote and how they wrote and reviewed each other's materials. But Lewis, by the way, died in 1963, and kind of a trivia point, he died on November 22nd, which happens to be the very same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Of course, Kennedy's assassination hit the news much more prevalently than the death of C.S. Lewis, but they both died on the same day in the same year. Anyways, he was a prolific writer. He wrote a ton of stuff, including works that were just purely literary. He wrote works that had to do with, like I said, Christianity. Some of his most famous non-fiction works were things like The Problem of Pain, The Abolition of Man, Mere Christianity. Among his fictional works, the Screwtape Letters is probably one of the most famous, which is kind of a guide. It's kind of a, man, it's a while since I've read it. Wormtail is being tutored by Screwtape. If I got the characters not backwards, it was kind of a demon on how to deceive, right? Kind of the tricks of the trade for the tutoring of a demon. Kind of an interesting Christian work, not necessarily fantasy. It's more of, like I said, a teaching series. Anyways, The one that I want to talk about very briefly was a work known as the Space Trilogy that he came out with, which was prior to Narnia. There were 3 books, obviously in a trilogy there have to be 3, that's part of the deal. Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. And in the last book in particular, he actually crosses over from sci-fi, which this what the series is about. It's a sci-fi series, but he crosses over into bringing back in stuff from medieval literature, particularly the Arthurian material with the introduction of Merlin and stuff like that. So I guess that's close to his passion, that whole idea of the medieval romance. So I like the way he kind of weaves that into science fiction. But the most famous of all of his works is by far the Chronicles of Narnia, which was a children's series written between 1950 and 56, or at least published between 1950 and 56. All right, so this is children's fantasy, but it's also Christian allegory. And I know we talked about allegory in the beginning of the semester, which happens to be this idea of telling a story using symbolic imagery to represent more complex maybe ideas or truths in a certain way. And again, with a children's story, the allegory might not be something that the children, at the younger ages would be able to pick up on, but it is definitely a Christian allegory. Okay, it's a retelling in some instances of various points of the Christian story, biblical stories, things like that, but also a lot of the Christian themes are brought forth in the Chronicles. Now, the original order, and this is not the order that you'll find them in if you buy the whole volume, the 7-volume set today, but the original publication order was Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which came out in 1950, Prince Caspian, 51, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is the one we're going to be discussing most directly today, and that was the 3rd in the series, 1952. Silver Chair, 1953, The Horse and His Boy in 54, Magician's Nephew in 55, and The Last Battle in 56. So he basically released one a year. And again, they're not long books, so you could see why they'd be easy for him to write within a short amount of time and get them published kind of back to back. But the first one is maybe the most famous and definitely the most significant of the series, and it's one we're going to actually talk about before I get to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because you do have to understand the background from that book before you can get into the plot of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because it kind of continues on from there. But the last couple books, again, being drawn from kind of Christian ideas that you find in the Bible, The Magician's Nephew is essentially the book of Genesis creation story in a Narnian version. So this is Lewis's creation story, and The Last Battle is basically his Narnian version of the book of Revelation, kind of the end of the world. Okay, kind of the first and last books of the Christian Bible there in the last couple books. Now, if you buy the volume set today, Magician's Nephew is going to be placed first. Last Battle is still the last one because it's released in the order chronologically as far as the world of Narnia goes. Okay, but that was not the original order that the books were published in. Now, let's start by talking about the background for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Okay, dealing with these Christian themes, we started to see these things creep into the history of mythology when we got to Beowulf, as far as the stories we've been reading, right? Here you've got a Christianized Germanic myth, and then by the time we get to King Arthur, you're going to see the Christian worldview a little bit more central, right? It's not just the fact, and it was true, obviously, that there's a lot of pagan material behind the story of King Arthur, which we discussed, but Christianity becomes much more central to the story, specifically when we get to the whole idea of the Holy Grail quest. Okay, but that's not the only piece. When we get to Narnia, right, jumping further ahead now into the 20th century, you're dealing with somebody, Lewis, who's writing a very intentional Christian story. Right? He's presenting a Christian worldview and a message in this gospel allegory. That's what you could say the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is. It's a gospel allegory. It's a retelling of the gospel from a different perspective. Not that it is purely allegorical. As a matter of fact, Lewis himself denied that the main character, Aslan, is an allegory for Christ. He kind of envisioned it more as a hypothetical otherworld Christ. That might not be the best way to put it, but kind of a hypothetical incarnation in this other world known as Narnia. Anyways, the plot of the story is World War II. Okay, the story is set in World War II of England. And the main children characters in the story are the four Pevensey children: Peter, Susan, Edmund, Lucy. They're also referred to as the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve, again, to make that connection to the whole human race and the human nature of these characters. And during the war, to get them out of London, they're sent to the country to live with a professor by the name of Professor Kirk. To tell you the truth, it's been a while since I've read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I don't remember if they give you the professor's name in this book, but later in the series, you're going to be introduced to this character, Diggory Kirk, who eventually will become the professor. But he's one of the first characters introduced, and he has this mansion out in the country where the children are basically kept safe. And one day, while they're playing hide and seek for the most part, they come across, at least one of them does, this wardrobe. This is the girl, Lucy, who's really, really I think out of the four, the most important of the children. Second most important being Edmund, as we'll see in a little bit, because they're the two characters that are going to be also present in the story of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But Lucy hides in this wardrobe, right? And the wardrobe is ultimately going to transport her into the world of Narnia. Now, the characters that are important in Narnia, there's a ton of them, but the only two that I'm going to mention right now will be the witch, or the White Witch, who is the ruler, and put that in quotes, of Narnia. She's actually the false ruler of Narnia, the queen of Narnia, and she's the key character who really represents Satan, right? It's kind of a hypothetical incarnation of Satan in this world. And then the most important figure of all, who only shows up periodically throughout the series, but always does make an appearance when least expected, is the character known as Aslan. Aslan is the son of the emperor over the sea. Now, like I said, he is the representative of Christ. He's the Jesus figure in the story. So he's the son of the emperor, and that would, of course, make the emperor God the Father. Now, the emperor is a character that you will never see in the story. Very much like the Christian tradition, right? God the Father isn't manifest the way Christ is, right? In Christian theology, Jesus is the incarnation of God in the flesh, the second person in the Trinity. This is kind of the background that Lewis understands when he's coming at the story from that kind of Trinitarian perspective. Okay, now that's important to understand, but let's further talk about the story of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as far as some themes go. Now, the themes, there's a number, and again, they're all core Christian themes. You got this theme of temptation and deception. So you've got the boy Edmund, who comes through the portal. And the first person he encounters when he comes into Narnia is the White Witch, with the queen, who tempts him, right? She tempts him with offering of candy, Turkish delight specifically, ends up deceiving him into thinking that, he's that she's really the legitimate ruler, and kind of convinces him to lure his brothers and sisters back into the realm so that she can ultimately take care of them. Anyways, so there's his whole story, this temptation, deception. He ultimately betrays the brothers and brother and sisters. And then you have this other theme of the ransom sacrifice, and that's going to be the big theme as far as the interaction between Aslan and the White Witch. All right, so it's this idea of a death and resurrection motif. And in doing this ransom, he's going to redeem the character of Edmund. Okay, and the character of Edmund is going to go through a transformation. So you've got all these things: temptation, ransom, redemption, transformation. And of course, transformation is the key thing that we're looking at in these hero stories. The actual redemption scene comes at a place in the story known as the stone table. Now, what happens is the queen requires the death of Edmund because he has betrayed. He's a traitor, okay? And according to the laws of the realm, or what was known as the deep magic from the dawn of time, she basically has claim to his life, right? So she's going to execute him. And what happens is Aslan ultimately decides he's going to negotiate his release from this penalty and take his place. So Aslan decides that he's going to die in place of Edmund, and the queen then executes Aslan on the stone table. Right? So this is essentially the crucifixion scene in the story of Narnia. But immediately afterward, the table breaks. The lion raises, is risen from the dead, and is according to what he refers to as the deeper magic from before the dawn of time. And this idea that anybody that's willing to lay down their life, an innocent life, willingly will reverse the curse of death. Okay, so That's this whole theme that comes out in the first story. And of course, at the end, there's a big battle, and you have the death of the witch, and kind of a happy ending as the children become kings and queens over Narnia for the rest of their lives until, as adults, they end up wandering back through the wardrobe and come out the other side, transformed back into children. Okay, so that's book one. Now, it introduces us to, again, the characters that we're going to need to follow, Edmund and Lucy. It's also introduced us for the first time to Aslan, and they're going to be really instrumental in the next story. But the other thing that's really important to point out is the role of the wardrobe. So I want to talk briefly about the role of the wardrobe in the story as the thing that presents us the call to adventure. So we've seen this in every story. This is one of the stages that Joseph Campbell talks about in his 17 stages, right? The call to adventure. The wardrobe is the adventure, right? Once you enter the wardrobe, it's the crossing of the first threshold, right? It's the liminal experience. It's where you're crossing over into the world of magic, the world of exploration. And the neat thing about it is, like we've said when we talked about the, how could I forget the names of things so quickly? Ready Player One, right? Ready Player One. We talked about this idea of the inside being bigger than the outside, this kind of experience that we have, which can be viewed as kind of an inward journey. Right, Campbell talks about the belly of the whale, something we might also refer to as the labyrinth. Right, when we see the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, he goes inward, right, into this labyrinth, it's this maze-like thing to face this deadly monster. Okay, and he's going to come out changed in a certain way. When you see Harry Potter, right, in the story of the Goblet of Fire, he enters this maze at the end, this final challenge, and there's going to be a huge transformation that takes place in the Harry Potter story. Again, that's the labyrinth motif. It's also, like I said, Campbell uses the term belly of the whale, which is actually drawn from the story of Jonah in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, or even the story of Pinocchio, one that you might be more familiar with if you're familiar with the famous, cartoon. This is also a very famous fairy tale in Italy, but it's a transformation story. The story of Pinocchio is a great transformation tale about this quest for life, essentially. Okay, and of course, the transformation of Pinocchio is from a wooden boy into a real boy by the end of his adventures. Okay, so this whole idea of inward journeying is kind of this into the subconscious, into the unconscious world, right? The realm of transformation. This is the way Campbell views it, as kind of a magical threshold into this womb of rebirth, this idea that you're going to come out newly born, right? Transformed. And it's through some kind of self-annihilation. That's why it's often a very dangerous situation. You go into a realm where you're going to die, right? It's this motif of death and rebirth. So again, it's this whole idea of a descent into the underworld that we've been talking about. Or you could also look at it not necessarily as, into the subconscious, but even maybe into the realm of the imagination. And that's what we kind of focused on when we talked about Ready Player One, this idea of this world that's boundless with this all kinds of potential, and again, where transformation can occur. So what lies across this threshold can be terrifying and dark, or it could be wondrous and bright. It really depends on the story and how it's used, but it's very much like dying either way, right? This idea of stepping into the darkness or stepping into the light. You probably heard those terms used of this experience of death, or at least near-death experiences. Okay, so that's what you're going through in the wardrobe. You're crossing over. And interestingly, Lewis actually ends the whole series with another scene that's kind of like the wardrobe, right? The wardrobe is really only used in the first book. But in the very last book, the last battle, you've got another door that's introduced. And the heroes at the end of this book step through this door. It was the door of a stable. And then they find themselves in this wide open country on the other side. Okay, they thought they were going in to be killed into this darkness, and then they emerge again into the light and bright open country. And Lewis draws a parallel in that book to this idea of an incarnation. Okay, again, the Christian theology is going to come across, and he kind of describes it as this idea of like the transcendent God wrapped in something immanent. This idea of Christ as God would have been something that transcends creation, yet at the same time God then becomes incarnate in creation itself. So it's the very last lines. I'll just read you, not the very last lines, but a couple of lines at the end of the last battle where they've gone through into the stable, and the character of Tyrion, smiling, says that the stable seen from within and the stable seen from without are two different places. Yes, said Lord Diggory, its inside is bigger than its outside. Yes, said Queen Lucy, in our world too, a stable once had something inside it that was bigger than our whole world. So right there, he's kind of drawing this attention back to his theme of God. And this again is the end. This is for the last battle. It's kind of the crossing over into the afterlife and into the realm of the divine. So that's kind of the same thing, kind of a parallel. And I like the way he does it, right? He book frames the story. He starts with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He starts with the door and this journey into this other realm. Very last book in the series, you have, again, almost an exiting from Narnia through a door into another realm. Kind of the way Gilgamesh itself, started with this idea of the descriptions of the walls of Uruk, and again at the end of the poem it returns to the description of the walls of Uruk. A lot of times you've got this idea of bookending your poem or your story, and Lewis kind of picks up on that kind of tradition here, which is kind of cool. All right, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Let's look at the list of just principal characters. I'll bring up a few photos of some of the characters. I'm using them from the movie version, which, again, I don't recommend. I recommend that you read the actual book. But the principal characters, you've got the character of Lucy Pevensey, who is the youngest of the 4 Pevensey children. Edmund, her older brother, but the next youngest among the 4. Those are the only 2 of the Pevensey children that are going to return in this book. The others have other things going on in their lives. But you're now introduced to a 3rd child from our world, which is the character of Eustace Clarence Scrubb, which, as they point out in the book, is a horrible name, but it belongs to a rather horrible boy. And this is a cousin to Lucy and Edmund. Okay, and we're going to really follow him more than anybody else in the course of our discussion of the book. The next character, King Caspian X, he's the king of Narnia. He was introduced into the book Prince Caspian, and that was basically his ascension to the throne. Then you also have his loyal companion, chivalric talking mouth by the name of Reepicheep. Kind of a silly character, but again, it's a children's book. Talking animals are very, very important in the whole Narnian mythos. Reepicheep is going to be one of the most memorable, I think, of all the talking animals in the entire series. You've got Lord Drinian, who is the captain of the Dawn Treader. You've got the 7 great lords of Narnia. Some of them actually appear in the story. We'll talk about what the quest is about in a second that relates to them. And then, of course, Aslan, right, the son of the emperor, who is, again, never described as a tame lion. As a matter of fact, he's specifically described as not a tame lion. And that's going to be a character that will show up periodically throughout the book. Kind of like, and I don't want to forget to refer back to other myths where we've seen some of these patterns, but if you remember the Volsunga saga, we looked at the story of Sigurd. Every once in a while in that story, you see Odin just show up out of nowhere. And again, they don't give you very much, but a description and you know who it is. Same type of thing. When you see a lion appear in Narnia, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, you're dealing with Aslan. He kind of comes and goes at his own will. And again, it's supposed to be a picture of the divine. And I think that's exactly what he is supposed to be, this kind of unpredictable, untamed force. Now, the call to adventure in the story. Let's start with Act 1, the separation. Do a very brief setup here. So we've got Lucy, Edmund, who are visiting their cousin Eustace in the beginning of the book. And this is a very brief section. Eustace is introduced. It really comes across as a bully. He is hateful, he's arrogant, he's greedy, he's cruel, he's definitely superior. He thinks he's better than they are. He's a little bit younger than Lucy and Edmund, but he's also very much an unbelieving character. And his unbelief, so one of the themes here is going to be this idea of faith, but one of the consequences of unbelief is you become blind. Again, to flash back to Oedipus, right? A character who was blind the entire time. Literally at the end of the story, he becomes physically blind, kind of an outworking of his inner self. But again, here's another character who is not willing to see, kind of like Oedipus was not willing to see what had happened, with the killing of his father, the marrying of his mother. He didn't know what was going on. Eustace, a little bit more intentionally blind, okay? Now, what's happening is they're having this discussion. They're in the bedroom together, and the children are looking at this painting on the wall, which happens to be the painting of a Narnian ship, or at least they say it reminds them of a Narnian ship. And he just mocks them. He makes fun of them, and kind of using this intellectual superiority, right? This is this kind of idea that they're caught up in all these childish things. They're not mature, All right, so he starts to mock them. He mocks the painting. He's got this attitude of intellectual skepticism. But what happens is what's in the painting comes to life, right? You got this reality that just kind of creeps in, and the scene in the movie looks a little bit like this. But the reality is that there is a real world on the other side. So what happens is, of course, the painting comes to life, the water pours in the room, and as they're wrestling around, they get sucked through the painting and end up in the sea, right, in the sea. As they swim to the top, they are eventually confronted right there with the Dawn Treader, right? The ship is right there in front of them. All right. So the interesting thing about it, not that it's not interesting enough that they're transported again into a world of wonder and mystery. This is obviously the crossing of the threshold and the call to adventure, specifically for Eustace. But the interesting thing is that Eustace reacts in a very bizarre way once he enters Narnia. He is still not convinced of anything that these kids have said about Narnia. He doesn't believe he's in another world. He doesn't believe in Narnia. He still professes to believe that this is just children's nonsense and is hoping to be rescued. Here he is at sea. He's hoping to be rescued by the Coast Guard, right? He's just blind to it, even though it's right there, basically hitting him in the face. So it's this idea of the reality creeping in. And it's going to be this contest between the rational versus the empirical. And his over-rationality or rationalism causes him really not to believe what his senses are telling him, what the truth is. It's a willing blindness, like I said. That's going to be really, really important for him. And it's going to be something he needs to do away with if he's going to become a hero by the end of the story. All right, so that's Act 1. Very, very brief, very short. Immediately, you're drawn into the world, and you're in Act 2. So before I get to Act 2, I want to remind you guys of the Platonic Trinity that we've discussed before. Right? The three human heroes in this story form a trinity like we've seen in other stories before, right? We talked about this idea of, Luke, Leia, and Han in Star Wars, or Bones, Kirk, and Spock in Star Trek, or Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor in the Avengers, right? These groupings of three heroes. Again, we're going to have that same type of parallel in this story, right? This is the parallel of, Plato's conception of the soul, which happens to deal with the different aspects, the noetic, the thumatic, and the epithumatic. If you don't remember those words, those would be essentially the reason, the spirit, and the appetite. Okay, the heart, or the head, the heart, and I guess you could say the belly, if you're going to put it into a physical position on the body. Right? So, most of the time, we said when we have these groupings of characters, they're going to represent a different aspect in that trinity, a different aspect of Plato's soul. And in this sense, I would place Lucy as the spirit, as the heart of the group. Okay. Now, it might not come across when you read The Voyage of the Dawn Treader very easily. You might not know where to place the characters. I think Eustace is easy to place, but Lucy, Edmund, a little bit more difficult perhaps. But the reason I would place Lucy in the position of the spirit has to do with her behavior initially in the book Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is why I said you need to understand Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe before you can understand these other books. She was definitely the central hero. I said normally the pattern is the central hero, when you have a trinity, is going to be the hero that represents the heart or the spirit. Okay, so Lucy, in a way, was the main character in the first book. She's the one that believed. She's the one that ended up trying to convince everybody else, even though they doubted her the whole way. Right? She was the one that has the first vision of Aslan. She's the one that kind of drives the whole group forward. She was the glue, right, that held the family together. Okay, so that's what her role was in the first story. And Edmund, I think you need to look at the first story as well to understand that he is the epithumatic character. He's the one who is all about appetite. If you look at the first book, remember how he was deceived. It has to do with his desire for candy, right? It's the passions, it's the physical. Turkish delight lured him away. And then by the end of that first book, he's the hero that's ultimately transformed, right? He had to change from becoming a traitor to his family to becoming kind of a noble warrior at the end of the story. Okay, so that was book 1. Third book, right now, we're going to be looking at the main hero, which obviously is going to be Eustace. Okay, now he's hyper-rational. Which again prevents him from being able to see what the truth is. And this is going to be a major issue for Lewis's worldview, right? The Christian worldview has a lot to do with this idea of believing things even when you don't see necessarily. Now, Lewis, like I said, had a background in philosophy and all this kind of stuff. He was not critiquing the use of reason, okay? by making Eustace kind of this rational character, the problematic character, right? Like I said, he studied philosophy. He understood Christian teaching as something that was uniting both faith and reason together. So what he's critiquing is what we might call rationalism, okay, which is an elevation of it or overconfidence in reason at the expense of other methods of coming to know or coming to truth. Okay, so that's the character that we need to deal with. So let's take a look at the quest. This is going to be Act 2 of the story. It's initiation. It's a reunion first with Caspian. Okay, so as soon as they're rescued from the sea, here he is on the boat, the king, now king, right? The guy that Lucian Edmund had known years earlier. So that's an interesting thing, this idea of reunion. Now, he's going to be on a quest, but the other quest is actually going to be a quest that is essentially Eustace's quest, and this is a call that's being presented to him. And when we have this refusal of the call, as Campbell talks about, I think this is definitely what's going on in the whole character of Eustace, right? He goes through the portal involuntarily, much like Ash in the Evil Dead movies did, but he is reluctant, right? He doesn't want the adventure. He denies that there's even an adventure being had, right? He wants to go home. So this is all his idea of, refusing the call. And he's convinced that, just bring me to a British consulate and they'll, take care of the rest, just want to get off this boat as soon as possible. But the two specific quests that the ship is out to attain are these. Number one, they are trying to attempt to find the lost lords of Narnia, right? So there's a theme introduced right away of this idea of redemption. Okay, that's the immediate quest, right? This idea of seeking what's lost. There are these 7 lords that served Caspian's father, who had been exiled when Caspian's father lost the throne, and he's now trying to retrieve them and bring them home again. Okay, so again, very Christian theme, this idea of finding what is lost, seeking what's lost, and saving it. The second theme, very much in line with Christianity itself, is this idea of reaching the utter east. Well, this is the ultimate quest, right? The ultimate boon. This is the final journey. This is that which there is nothing further to attain, right? This is what we mean by ultimate, right? There's nothing beyond that. So this is the quest for Aslan's country, Aslan's, the land of the emperor. And it's the deepest desire, specifically for the character of Reepicheep in the story, right? It's the thing that he wants more than anything else, is to see this land, no matter what it costs him. Now, this idea of reaching the utter east is the journey to heaven, okay, for Lewis. And there has to be a transformation before you can arrive at your destination. And that's where it's going to be important to deal with the character of Eustace. Okay, if they're going to reach this final destination, something needs to be transformed. So let's take a look at the heroic transformation that Lewis gives us in the character of Eustace. He's miserable from the very beginning of the story. He's at odds with everybody, right? He has specific animosity towards Reepicheep. They've kind of almost, mortal enemies. Not that they're necessarily at that stage, but you get the idea, right? Now, the transformation is going to come when they arrive on what's basically called Dragon Island, right? And it's going to be the battle with the dragon that we've seen over and over again in mythology. This is actually the second island on the voyage, so the transformation is going to take place pretty early on in the story. But the dragon adventure we've seen from the very beginning with the Enuma Elish, the contest between Marduk and Tiamat. We've seen it with Heracles and the Hydra. We've seen it with Thor and the World Serpent. Esfandiar fought a dragon. Sigurd slays Fafnir. Beowulf kills a dragon. Bilbo deals with Smaug. We've talked about all of these things. So this is not an uncommon motif. Lewis is going to do it in a different way, though. This is the neat thing. He puts in a twist. Okay, the battle with the dragon in this book is an internal battle. Okay, and it's because Eustace is literally changed into a dragon. He gets on this island, he departs from the ship, he goes off on his own, and he witnesses a dragon dying. Doesn't know exactly what it is because he's not familiar with fantasy, right? He's too mature for that. So he sees this dragon that dies in front of him. He goes into the cave, he finds this hoard of gold in the lair. It arouses this greed. He starts to pocket a bunch of jewels, and one particular object, which is this bracelet, this golden jeweled bracelet, he puts on his arm. Right? He actually pushes it way up on his upper arm because he's kind of puny kid, and then ends up falling asleep. And it's while he's sleeping that you have a transformation take place. Now, the transformation is actually into a dragon. Now, when he awakes, he doesn't realize that he's a dragon. He actually thinks there's a dragon near him because when he looks to the side, he sees dragon. When he looks to the other side, he sees dragon. He thinks he's kind of closed in between two dragons. He doesn't really know what to do. But after a while, he realizes that it's just him that he's seeing. He's seeing himself to either side. So what you're dealing with here is really a revelation. We can call it a transformation, but it's the first stage in a real transformation. But it's a revelation. And what I mean by that is what you're seeing is his inner character manifest outwardly. What he was inside comes to the surface, as it often does in everybody, right? He's a beast. That's his true self. And now he looks like a beast. And that's going to cause all kinds of problems, but it's going to have a good result in the end. So we're going to look again at this whole idea of wild to civilized, right? This whole transformation idea. Same thing we saw in the very beginning. He awakes, like I said, with great pain. And the pain is because of the bracelet. All right, the armband. He realizes, as soon as he sees that he's a dragon, a couple things. He realizes that he has power for the first time. The power to get even with the people that have done him wrong, whatever that means, like Caspian and Edmund. But the second thing he realizes is that he actually doesn't want to get even, right? He realizes that he's actually cut off from the human race and that he's a monster. Kind of like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, right? This whole idea of Gilgamesh being cut off from civilization because of his character. Enkidu being cut off as a wild man out in the wilderness, needed to be civilized before he could be introduced to the city of Uruk. Right? Here he is cut off from the human race, and all he really desires is to have friends, right? To change back into a boy, maybe change into a boy for the first time. And immediately he also realizes he can't communicate. There's no way for him to talk as a dragon. So he can't go back to the others and convince him. And of course, they're going to react when they see him. He's a dragon. They're probably going to try to kill him. So he loses more and more contact with what it means to be human. He loses human communication, which is a big problem. Now, the interesting thing is that it's Lucy, right? So here we bring up the text a little bit. It fell behind there. But it's Lucy who approaches him out of basically compassion. Reepicheep is the other one who actually goes along with him, with her. So the two of them actually are brave enough to approach Eustace. One out of bravery, and that would definitely be Reepicheep because he's kind of this, overly brave, confident mouse, in spite of the fact that he is a very small mouse. And then Lucy, who just overlooks danger very often because she actually cares. They're the only ones that are able to approach him and start asking him questions. And of course, the only thing he could do is nod his head. But of course, by his responses, they're able to figure out who this is. And it's at that point that you actually begin this transformation. It begins with his character. He starts to become human, right? But the start happens to be in the inside. It's got to start to be a change of heart, change of attitude. And only after he begins to change is he able to begin to see things clearly. Now, this whole process, he starts to help out. He starts to do things to help the ship, to help the crew, to get those food for them. For the first time in the whole story, he does things instead of just sitting there pouting, moping, complaining. He becomes useful. Now, because of his change of attitude, he has an encounter with Aslan. Aslan shows up, and this is going to be this moment of divine intervention. And he's going to introduce a process by which Eustace can transform back into human. Now, the process is going to involve undressing and bathing in a well. This is an idea of like a water baptism scene, a death and rebirth. Now, Eustace tries to undress, and what that means is kind of take the dragon skin off. And he scratches at his scales, and he kind of pulls the scales off, and then he kind of pulls his skin off, kind of like the serpent, right? The serpent, that is one of the characteristics, is they shed their skin. So he does this, and it's painful, but ultimately it's futile. He actually tries this 3 times. And after the 3rd time, where he fails to take the dragon's skin off, Aslan says, "Let me undress you." And what he does is he takes his lion claw out, and he punctures through the chest of the dragon, right to the heart. Right? It says it cuts deep. It's incredibly, incredibly intense pain. But at the same time, Lewis describes it as a pleasure. Right? Even though it's incredibly agonizing, there's something pleasurable about it. And this is the real transformation. This is the idea that I think he's getting across in this story, because from his worldview perspective, when it comes to a real transformation, that requires something beyond the individual. Right? It's not this idea in his worldview that you can just retreat into oneself and come out a different person, but it's this idea that God has to act and do something. Right? That's part of the Christian message that he's presenting, that you can't change yourself and needs something greater than that. Okay, but again, it is the wild to civilized transformation. He becomes literally an animal, and then he's transformed to a man. As a matter of fact, Eustace himself, after he transforms back, actually says, "I'm afraid I've been pretty beastly." I mean, to make it even more obvious if you didn't catch it, he refers to himself as a beast. And not long after that, they say, for the first time, actually from that time forward, Eustace was a different boy. Okay? To show you that this transformation is complete. As a matter of fact, the very end of the book, they repeat it again. I think it might be the last page. I don't remember if it's exactly the last page, but it's almost the last page of the book. It says, "You would never know him for the same boy." Okay, so whatever he was in the beginning really changes here, but they still talk about it after that in the text, that he still has, relapses. It's hard to be completely different. He still every once in a while is kind of a annoying character, but he's ultimately changed, so he gets over that effectively. Okay, so that's the transformation. I think that's the core theme of this entire story, but it's not the only theme. So let's take a look at this whole idea of transformation in the three phases that we've dealt with before. I'm going to show you kind of a Christian parallel to the transformation process we've seen before. When we talked about the heroic transformation, we always said there were different acts, like in a heroic story or in a play or in a movie, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Right, things that Aristotle talks about, the beginning, the middle, and the end. For Campbell, it was separation, initiation, and return. This is the one I think we've used the most. When we talk about the three phases of the monomyth, we usually use Campbell's terminology, but we've looked at others, right? We looked at, separation, transition, incorporation, Arnold van Gennep, right? This what's it called? Yeah, initiation rites. Rank, when he did the family romance, we talked about true home, exile and return. Now we're going to have a religious parallel to that, and this is another three phases that I guess you can think of as more maybe a spiritual transformation. This is the kind of one that you'll find in Christian theology. The Christian parallel is one of repentance, which is separation from our past self, sin, who we were, the process of justification, which is through the death and resurrection of Christ, okay? And it's represented in this whole idea of dying in baptism, right? This is the motif. If you don't understand the symbolic imagery of baptism, it's supposed to be, even right there in the New Testament, they talk about it as dying and being buried, okay? So again, the hero's death and rebirth. And then the last phase is what's called sanctification or perfection, this idea of coming out with the virtues, right? Again, the hero story is, again, the same type of thing. You have the character who needs to die, needs to change, needs to become something better that models the virtues and values of a society, okay, or even universal virtues and values. So there's this whole parallel here that, not Campbell, but Lewis is using, okay, very close parallel to Campbell's own monomyth. Now, picking up one more theological theme, and this is the one we're going to kind of carry through to the end of this little discussion, is the quest for eternal life. We're going to call this kind of a hide-and-seek thing, because what we're looking at is, again, a quest for the land of Aslan, right? The country of Aslan at the end of the world. This is the original quest. This is the first thing that we ever came across when it came to Gilgamesh, right? The quest for immortality, the Holy Grail. Apples of the Hesperides, right? Those are symbols of immortality that Heracles had to go retrieve. It's a quest for heaven, right? It's a quest for God, ultimately, the ultimate destination. Now, it's going to involve, again, a sea voyage, so we're going to be crossing the waters. And again, just remember the things we've seen before, right? The limit of the world is the beginning of the next world, right? When you go to the edge, when you go to the terminus, all right, the only thing you can go then is crossing over that bound. That's why we call it a liminal experience. Whether it's Gilgamesh going to the land of Dilmun, the voyage of the Argonauts going to the garden of where the golden fleece is kept, whether it's even Odysseus' voyage home, you could think of that as a quest, or Arthur, right, sailing to Avalon at the end, right, this crossing over. Now, these characters are on their quest for this eternal life, right, heaven, essentially. But in their quest, they come across other characters along the way, and one interesting stop on the trip happens to be where the Duffers are, okay, the island of the Duffers. Now, these are these little characters that you really know what they look like, because when we first find them in the story, they're invisible. And I think the theme that's going on here is really this idea of hiding, right, from God, right? It's the antithesis of the quest. It's the opposite of the quest. These duffers are what are called dufflepuds, are these foolish little characters that are overly gullible in a way. They actually kind of agree with everything anybody says. They're not very intelligent, and they're at this place where there's this wizard who they see as a tyrant. Of course, you find out later that the wizard's not at all a tyrant. It's just their perception of him. But they believe that the wizard has made them ugly through some kind of uglification spell. And what they've been wanting to do is get into the wizard's house and find this book of magic and find what's known as the spell of invisibility and use the spell to change themselves. Actually, what they did, they don't want to change themselves invisible. They've already done this. They changed themselves invisible, okay, because of their ugliness. They'd rather be invisible than be ugly. Now, Lucy is supposed to go into the house to get to the book to, break the spell ultimately. She does some interesting things while she's in there. You get some insight into kind of social interaction, not falling into rumor. And one of the things that she sees in this book is kind of her home world, her friends. She kind of spies through the book on people that she knows, and they, in a way, seem to be betraying her. They talk bad about her behind her back, and she's kind of heartbroken at that moment. And in this whole instance, she eventually is confronted with Aslan. Right, he's there all along. When she reads the spell of invisibility to break the spell of invisibility, sure enough, Aslan shows up himself because he was just invisible. But he kind of chastises her for not believing in her friends, and this whole idea of faith in people that you care about and people that care about you, and just this idea of human weakness and frailty in general, that there are proclivity to maybe say things that we don't really mean when we're put under pressure. So you got these kinds of themes that are brought out. But the big theme, I think, in this bizarre whole series is that the act of hiding, right, this idea of trying to cover up their ugliness through hiding, making themselves invisible. What we find out is, Aslan himself is invisible. The wizard also becomes invisible. In theological terms, this is usually referred to as the idea of the hiddenness of God. This idea of, why can't we see God? It very often has to do with things in ourselves that get in the way. This is what Lewis, I think, is trying to bring across. It's kind of this sin, failing, this corruption that ultimately causes us to hide. This is a flashback to a story we read in the beginning again, the Adam and Eve story. Right after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what did they do? Is they hid, right? They hide from God. Now, the idea in this idea of hiddenness of God is that when one hides from God, then he becomes less visible even to them, right? And the idea is those who don't seek are never going to find. Okay, so here you've got this idea where you're balancing between a group that are on a quest to find God and this other group that, in their foolishness, is ultimately hiding from God. So it's kind of a antithesis that's set up in that story. It's kind of a neat little scene. One of the most memorable of the story. But again, there's a lot of stops along the way. And I'm not going to hit all of them, but a number of other islands on this road of trials. Some of them very dangerous. Deathwater Island, where if you touch the water, you turn to stone. You've got the island where dreams come true, which sounds like a wonderful place, but when you get down to it, it doesn't matter whether they're good dreams or bad dreams. It's a land that's very tempting, but at the same time, your nightmares can become reality. Eventually get to the island known as the Island of the Star, where there is the fallen star by the name of Ramandu. And he has at his table three of the three final lords, right? They've been trying to find the 7 lords of Narnia. They found a few of them along the way. Some of them have died. But here they are at the edge of the world, and these 3 guys are essentially in an enchanted sleep, right? They need to be redeemed, and to awaken them, the crew needs to go to the very end of the world where they have to leave a man behind. This is the idea of there needs to be a cost, right? To wake them, to redeem them, and to bring them home, somebody has to lay down their life for them. All right, and that's going to take place at the end of the world. And the neat thing as you approach the end of the world, thinking back to Gilgamesh, thinking back to crossing of the waters of death, you've got this interesting picture. It's a little bit more bright and shining than Gilgamesh's voyage, but the saltwater sea that they're crossing ultimately turns into a sea of fresh water, covered with lilies as they reach the silver sea, the very end, right? And it's very shallow. By the way, the lily, this beautiful white plant which sits on the top of the water, is a symbol in various places of purification, right? So as they're approaching the end, they're being purified. They get out of the big boat. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader needs to be set aside. It's too big to go through the shallow water, so they take a smaller vessel. And it's only Lucy Edmund, Eustace, and Reepicheep who are allowed to go to the very end. Now, in the movie version, if you've seen the movie version, Caspian goes with them. That's not part of the book. That's a big change, I think. Caspian is actually specifically told by Aslan that he's not allowed to go. But when they get there, there's this wall of water, okay? And it's flowing upward. Now, Reepicheep takes out this little corkel, this little teeny boat that he gets in, and he sails into the waterfall and goes up, over, and across into Aslan's country. This is the death of the character. He's the character who's basically staying, allowing the redemption of the lords that are in the Enchanted Sleep back on the journey. Right? He's going to cross over. But again, this is his biggest passion, right? This idea of finding the land of Aslan. And it's a death scene. I mean, literally a death scene. And the whole voyage is really, the conquest of death. But for him, he's not going to return. It's one of the nicest pictures of death that you can get in mythology, but it's death nonetheless. Okay, so we won't see him again. The last part of the story is where you have the appearance of Aslan, who actually shows up in a very different manner than he's appeared in other stories up to this point. He appears as a lamb, right, walking down the beach as this lamb. And then he becomes, in the course of talking with them, a lion right before their eyes. This is, again, a drawing back to descriptions of Christ that you'll get in the New Testament, this idea of the Lamb of God, right, the sacrifice, this idea of the Lion of Judah, right, this kind of kingly figure, kind of both at the same time. And the children are going to be then transported back home at the very end, and they're going to be told that there are other ways, multiple ways, to get to Aslan's country. As a matter of fact, you can get to Aslan's country from all the different worlds, even their world. And as a matter of fact, Edmund and Lucy will never, ever again return to Narnia. And he kind of gives them this idea that they need to find him in a different way. They need to learn about him by a new name. But whatever way they go to his country, it's always going to involve crossing over water, crossing a river. And then Aslan is described as the bridge builder. Now, this is the idea of the priest. Again, if you're not familiar with the ways Christ is described in the New Testament, priest or high priest is one of them. Now, the idea of a bridge builder that Lewis is drawing on, I'm guessing, relates to his knowledge of ancient history and religion. The Romans had priests. They were known as the pontifex or pontifices. A pontifex was a priest, and the word pontifex in Latin is related to this idea of a bridge, pons. Okay, so the pontifex is a bridge builder of sorts. That's exactly what a priest is. So when Aslan is described as a bridge builder, this is the idea. He's kind of the priest, the high priest, even the Pontifex Maximus, if you want to call him that. The way that you cross over. I mean, again, in Christian theology, Christ is the way that one can attain heaven. Okay, and without that bridge, there's no hope. Okay. So kind of like, again, Gilgamesh. So we're going to go back to this whole theme. Gilgamesh, the transit, he gets to the edge of the world. He crosses over, gets to the land of Dilmun. He meets with Utnapishtim. He wants to find out the secret of immortality. And what does he find out? That he can't get immortality. That Utnapishtim has immortality only because the gods did something and gave it to him. It's kind of similar to the message here, that without something being done for you by the gods, that there's no hope. Okay? And that's kind of where we leave. The children are transported back, and of course, at the very end, you get this idea that Eustace is not the same boy, that you would never recognize him for the same boy. So the story kind of wraps up, like I said, with a nice bookend. Got a transformation, heroic transformation. And the neat thing is, again, it's a children's book, as the whole series is. But at a certain level, a lot of this stuff would fly over the head of a child. Okay, as a matter of fact, even adults that are not familiar with what's going on in the mythology, what's going on in the religious tradition, the theological ideas, if you're not familiar with that kind of stuff, you can miss very easily a lot of the stuff. I know when I was younger, that whole scene with the Duffelpuds, it just was bizarre to me. It was really interesting, but I didn't have a way to understand what he was trying to say. I understand that Lewis was a Christian author who was trying to get across Christian themes and concepts, but I had no idea what to make of that particular theme or particular scene. So hopefully it makes a little bit more sense unpacking it this way. But again, we've been following along this whole movement from paganism now to really the most Christian of the stories that we've looked at. I mean, King Arthur is one thing, Quest for the Holy Grail, obviously some Christian themes there, but here you've got a very intentional attempt to promote a particular worldview through the mythology, but it still coheres or at least lines up with all of the things we've been looking at as far as the hero's journey is concerned. Now, our next and final discussion is going to be on another modern work, also produced in England. It's going to be the Harry Potter discussion. Okay, J.K. Rowling. So next time we're going to be taking a look at Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.